morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mark Massa, and I'm an Associate Director at the Scowcroft Center's Forward Defense Program. I'm pleased to welcome you to this morning's event, the Near Crisis Project, What You Don't Know Can Hurt You. Here at the Atlantic Council, our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. We seek to honor General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embody his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Consistent with that mission, Forward Defense is focused on generating ideas and connecting stakeholders in the defense ecosystem to promote an enduring military advantage for the United States and its allies and partners. The escalation of crisis to war is a perennial subject of interest for the foreign policy community. Facing renewed strategic competition, U.S. policymakers are keenly interested in better understanding why some crises escalate to armed conflict while others do not. There has been much less focus, however, on how crises arise in the first place. How can crises be managed before they escalate? At a time when the United States and its allies are faced with Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, an increasingly aggressive China, and North Korea's growing nuclear and missile arsenal, among other challenges, this research could provide tools to help policymakers identify and de-escalate potential flashpoints around the globe. To discuss the topic of near crises, we are privileged today to welcome a range of distinguished experts. The first segment of our event will feature a brief keynote presentation from Dr. Stephen Lobel, Suzanne Whedon-Levy, Dr. Norden Ripsman, and Dr. Scott Silverstone, each members of the research team of the Near Crisis Project. Dr. Lobel is a professor of political science at the University of Utah. Ms. Whedon-Levy is the research director at the State University of New York at Albany. Dr. Ripsman is the Monroe J. Rathbone Professor of International Relations Department at Lehigh University. Dr. Silverstone is a professor of international relations in the Department of Social Sciences at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Following their remarks, we will move on to a panel of experts to discuss the implications of this work. Dr. Silverstone will join this panel alongside Dr. Lance Hampton, Dr. Sonia Finley, Dr. Thomas F. Lynch, and Dr. Brian Babcock-Lumish. The panel will be moderated by Clementine Starling. Dr. Hampton is the Director for Strategy in the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. Dr. Finley is a Professor of Strategy at the National War College. Dr. Lynch is a Distinguished Research Fellow at the National Defense University. This panel will be moderated by Clementine Starling, Director of the Forward Defense Program. I would like to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record. We encourage our audience on Zoom to ask questions using the Q&A tab, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. During the Q&A session, our in-person audience members can raise their hands with any questions, and a member of our staff will bring you an iPad to type them out. Since this event is public, please be sure to identify your name and your affiliation with your question. We also encourage our audience to join the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag #ForwardDefense. Once again, thank you all for being with us for this event, and I'd like to turn it over to the research team for a brief keynote presentation on their findings. Thank you.
Good morning, and Mark, thank you for the introduction. I'm Stephen Lobel, Professor of Political Science at the University of Utah and PI of the Minerva Research Award. I want to extend a couple thank yous before we get started. I want to thank Atlantic Council for hosting this workshop for us on the Near Crisis Project. I want to thank the Minerva Research Initiative and Office of Naval Research for their funding, and also the opportunity for us to present our work to the policy community and help bridge the gap. I'd also like to thank our multi-university team, many of whom you'll meet and hear from today. I want to thank you for your support and your hard labor in this project. And I also want to thank the multiple graduate students and RAs and undergraduates and staff, especially at the University of Utah, who've been involved in this project and really essential players in helping us accomplish what we've accomplished. We're going to take about 15 minutes and introduce the concept of near crisis, and that'll be followed by a moderated panel discussion of invited guests and an opportunity to solicit feedback on our project also. Some of the questions that we want to address in the next 15 minutes is really, what is this concept of near crisis, and why is it important? We are interested in the defense implications and the policy for policy practitioners, and also the implications for U.S. grand strategy. And finally, what do we want you, the audience, to take away from this workshop? It's important for us to understand that near crises are part of the pre-crisis space, and this is one of the pathways to a full-blown crisis. These near crises operate on the knife's edge of tipping or escalating to full-blown crisis, but it's important to understand they haven't done so yet. Some of these will escalate to full-blown crises, but a number of these cases will also de-escalate and never become a crisis. For instance, some of the cases that we have studied in some detail is the 2006 Second Lebanon War. And the Second Lebanon War starts as a near crisis following a raid across the border into Israel, and it escalates into a full-blown crisis and escalates into a full 34-day war. Another case that we've studied is the October 2015 Iran ballistic missile test, and this testing of a ballistic missile did not escalate into a crisis, although it could have, because it violated several UN Security Council resolutions. Pre-crisis and near crisis are often neglected. They're treated as footnotes. They're treated as afterthoughts, with the focus really on crisis escalation, crisis management, and war prevention. We see this in several reports in the Quadrennial Defense Review, in the National Security Strategy, and the National Defense Strategy. All of these fail to mention or discuss this pre-crisis space. They fail to discuss this idea of crisis prevention versus crisis management versus crisis escalation versus war prevention. One really important notable exception, though, is NATO's 2020 strategic concept. NATO's 2020 strategic concept has one of its core tasks as crisis prevention and crisis management. What's new here is the concept of crisis prevention. And the core task is very clear that these are efforts to anticipate and prevent crisis and conflicts. Why is the concept of near crisis important? What we've done in this project is map the escalation cycle from disputes to war. And in mapping this escalation cycle, what we've discovered is there's two off-ramps to conflict management, not just the one that most scholars and policymakers focus on. Again, scholars and policymakers tend to focus on successful crisis management, and they focus on cases like the Berlin blockade and the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, as we'll discuss today, there's an earlier opportunity for crisis management, for crisis prevention. While some near crises that we've talked about do escalate into full-blown crisis, there's these cases that we call standalone cases that don't. These standalone cases are successfully prevented from escalating into full-blown crises, and these are the cases that we focus on also. Second, in mapping this full escalation cycle, we look at different actors that are involved in near crises, be it great powers, be it rogue states, be it non-state actors, and the effect they have on near crises and crisis escalation. What do we want you to take away from this workshop? What we really present is a framework, a way to think about this pre-crisis space. First, we provide a framework for policymakers and their staffers to think about this pre-crisis space. It offers practitioners really an early warning and enhanced opportunities to initiate policy steps that could manage potential dangers, and the emphasis is on before full crises emerge. Second, as one of the pillars of a U.S. grand strategy of restraint, managing near crises at the pre-crisis stage is essential to prevent these forever commitments and forever wars. In the future work, we will continue to look on explore the pre-crisis space, and we're interested in examining why some disputes escalate slowly, why others escalate more rapidly. Before I hand this over to Suzanne, who will talk about the near crisis definition, the different kinds of types of near crises, and our findings about non-state actors, if you have questions or you want to reach out to us in the future, please contact us at the Near Crisis Project at utah.edu. Suzanne?
All right, thank you so much, Stephen. So I'd just like to provide some brief definitions for near crises, or what we call NICBs, and their subcategories. So it's important to note that near crises events take place prior to international crisis events, and thus are at a lower level in that escalation cycle. So as you can see on the slide, two conditions need to be met to meet the threshold of a near crisis. So it occurs when within the highest leadership of a given state, there is both a perception of a threat to basic values and a perception of a short or finite time horizon to respond. So no perception of a heightened probability of military hostilities is necessary. Next slide. So we then split near crises into two distinct categories. A standalone near crisis, or SA-NICB, occurs when the near crisis does not escalate into a full-blown international crisis. We then, in contrast, a preceding near crisis, or PNICB, does escalate into a full-blown crisis. So it can either immediately escalate, or within 6 months of the PNICB's initial trigger, it can escalate into a full-blown crisis. So I also want to briefly mention the work the Albany team has been doing concerning non-state actors' role in near crises. So they can be a complicating factor, and we actually have found they act as proxies for states potentially triggering a near crisis. We have also found that they are more likely to be involved in these events if they have higher capabilities. So specifically, if they're more lethal, so if they have higher casualties with their activities or attacks, and if they have a state sponsor. So I'm going to pass it over to Pat. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. What we have in the slide that you see now in terms of a takeaway is a comprehensive vision from our point of view that introduces a key element that's already been described to some degree and will be elaborated further, and that is a near crisis. The escalation process is not a simple one, and there are multiple off-ramps, contingencies. And as I introduce the pieces of this particular puzzle we're putting together, we've used colors and shapes to make it a little easier for you to follow what's up there and make it out. Along the bottom, in lowercase with green ovals, green means go, you have the perceptions of leaders. So starting on the left side, you will see the near crisis conditions, perceptions of leaders in the US or elsewhere in a case, a threat to basic values and a finite time to cope with it. This can lead to a near crisis. That's in the purple hexagon. Interactions ensue. If you take a happy left turn here, you have what is called, you'll see our acronym for it, a standalone near crisis. Whew, that's good news, if you can get one. Well, that's not necessarily what will happen. It can go in the other direction, and as summarized a moment ago, there are a couple of different kinds of PNICBs, or pre-ICB crisis near crises. One possibility is it just escalates directly into a crisis. The other is that it's de-escalatory. Think of a fire that goes out for a little while but reignites. Now, when you look along the bottom again at the third green oval, you see the third key perception that gets us to the crisis level, and that is military hostilities, as in we're at risk of war, putting it simply. Above, you now see ICB crisis conditions. They are brought together for the participants. They're highly dangerous, and a couple of different possibilities in those stop signs that are up there. One, further good news, another off-ramp is the ICB crisis de-escalates. Once again, unfortunately, we can also have war. So I'll be provocative in finishing up as I look at this. To paraphrase Churchill, our project believes that we have located a hidden hinge of fate, as he might have put it if he were on our team. We pay a lot of attention to crises, escalation to war, but what do we know about a possible key and mysterious step beforehand? And that might well be near crisis. Our findings validate the concept of near crisis in that there seems to be an extraordinary degree of importance attached to whether a threat to basic values and finite time to cope with it are perceived, or alternatively, we go beyond the near crisis world. We have one last chance for the off-ramp that's been studied more, that is crisis not escalating to war, but we know very little, if you look once again at this diagram, about what's going on at the near crisis level. We have collected data on this, analyzed it extensively through both statistics and case studies, and we believe that some pretty interesting things have been discovered already.
Thank you, Pat. I guess I should mention that Patrick James, a professor emeritus at University of Southern California, was a last-minute addition to this panel. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about why we think near crises and the pre-crisis space is important to U.S. national security planners, and in addition to that, talk a little bit more about mapping the pre-crisis space beyond near crises, which we are now heading into. Preventing crises is essential in order to enable the United States successfully to pursue a grand strategy of restraint. The U.S. currently favors a strategy of restraint for two key reasons. One, restraint helps conserve scarce resources in a turbulent international security and economic environment. Second of all, it avoids a posture that might appear threatening to other states, which might inspire blowback and complicate U.S. grand strategy. Significantly, preventing crises rather than managing crises once they occur can avoid a needless waste of economic and military power resources. As near crises escalate, they can drag the United States into crises and even the use of force, wars, both of which have long-term resource implications. Crises and militarized international conflicts tend to inspire long-term policy commitments, which are sticky and tend not to be drawn down after the crisis abates or the conflict abates. Think, for example, of the landscape of Western commitments to Ukraine after this conflict ends. It seems unlikely that it's going to drop down to what it was before the escalation. So preventing crises is a critical but highly underemphasized component of a grand strategy of restraint. This requires careful attention to what we call the pre-crisis space, of which near crisis is an important component, but it isn't the only component. In fact, the team has identified multiple paths to crisis, which we're already seeking funding to study. So if any of you actually happen to have some extra money lying around in your pockets, we'd be only too happy to help you out by taking it off your hands so that we can study other paths to crisis. So we've identified, as mentioned, the near crisis, which we've already studied extensively, where you have a threat to basic values and a restricted time frame to respond, but not yet a heightened risk of escalation. But we've also identified some other critical paths for policymakers, such as what we call heightened risk episodes, where there's a threat to basic values and there is a perception of a heightened risk of escalation, but there's not yet the perception of a restricted time frame to respond, which is another significant path to crisis. There's also the bolt from the blue, where there's a threat to basic values, but neither of the other conditions is present. And finally, there's the enduring rivalry, which is essentially a persistent heightened risk episode, where conditions 1 and 3 persist. That is, you have a threat to basic values and you have the perception of a heightened risk of military escalation, but that endures and persists for a period of time, and therefore it's a different causal path that policymakers need to be aware of. Each of these pathways, we believe, has distinct dynamics that must be managed differently. So if U.S. and Western national security planners were aware of these different pre-crises and their implications for policy and for management, that would enable them to act more efficiently to prevent crises and conflicts that threaten U.S. interests and necessitate costly efforts to contain them. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We'll be starting the second panel very shortly.
Welcome back to this discussion of the Near Crisis Project. I'm Clementine Starling, the director of the Atlantic Council's Forward Defense Program. I am very thrilled to be moderating this fantastic panel with a range of experts. We've got a lot of experts on the stage here. You just heard from the folks who really led a lot of the research as part of this project, putting together this very, very detailed kind of research report. We're now going to get into a little bit of a discussion of taking that framework. What are kind of some of the top takeaways? What are the policy implications that we all need to be considering? So I know our panel has been introduced previously by Mark, but I did want to very briefly kind of turn to Scott, who was critically involved in the project, playing a key role to provide us with some kind of opening thoughts. What do we need to be thinking about? Tee us up for this conversation, Scott, based on the last presentation.
Okay, good. Let me tee up the conversation. Thanks, Clementine. And thanks to the Atlantic Council for having us. Good morning, and thanks for my colleagues and friends for coming out to join us for this panel. What I'd like to do is just run through a couple of top-line findings, if you will. And I would imagine my colleagues on the panel are going to elaborate and perhaps help us understand, give us a chance to sort of play around and tease out the implications of some of the key things that, as the person on the research team that's focused on what are the policy implications for the academic work that we've done, to me there's some really useful and exciting ways to think from a policy practitioner perspective. And the folks that have joined us this morning are really in a position with deep military, strategic, and academic experience to help us flesh these out. So, you know, right from the start, I like to think about this going back to Alexander George, the political scientist who did the most to advance this notion of bridging the gap between the academic community and what policymakers need, perhaps to leverage the kind of work that we do for policy problems that they're grappling with. And one of the things that Alexander George talks about is the value of this kind of research in diagnosis. Diagnosis of the particular policy problems that you confront. And I think just as an opening statement, the work that we're doing, I hope, pushes back against this natural inclination within the policy community to really wait until crises are at full fruition to actually jump in and try to manage, divert, diffuse. If we can actually sort of play around with this concept that's on the slide behind me and open up these situations, these policy trouble spots that emerge within different parts of the international system, and provide a set of concepts that policymakers, analysts, intel collectors can actually use. What do you watch within the international system to actually identify what we're calling as near crises? So the diagnosis piece of this right off the bat. And there's a lot more that I can say, but just to sort of put some meat on the bones of what we're looking at in terms of the components of how we've defined international crises. These different components that you see at the bottom are actually conditions that can be shaped, I think, by those in policy perspectives. When you think about the three green blocks at the bottom of this escalatory process, it begins with a threat to basic values. The origins of these threats, the intensity of these threats is certainly something that should be highlighted, bracketed, and considered to be one element that could be manipulated through a range of policy tools that you might have. What's really interesting, I think this is, to me, one of the most exciting parts of sort of conceptually thinking through this, is the second characteristic, the second condition, finite time to respond. Time pressure compels action. We know that threats alone do not constitute crisis. There are enduring threats all around the world, and historically, something has to move along the escalatory ladder to increase pressure on key leaders to actually take action that might drive us toward war. How do you manipulate that particular variable, the finite time to respond? And the last thing that I'll say, and we can come back to this, there's a lot of great cases that we've worked on that I'd be happy to discuss, some of which are in the paper and perhaps you'd like to talk about as well. It is, this project sensitizes us to what H.R. McMaster's been talking a lot about in terms of strategic empathy, and the fact that crises and near crises can come in one-sided forms, in that even if you believe from your leadership or your national perspective that a particular crisis or trouble spot has been defused, and if you're not appreciating how the perceptions of adversaries, of allies, of neutrals, in terms of where they think they are when it comes to perceptions of threat, perceptions of finite time to respond, and maybe the likelihood of military conflict to emerge from here, you may miss what ultimately becomes the most important driver of the escalation process, and it's what the other actors are doing. So pay attention to the other actors. I'll leave it there, and we can come back to some other thoughts that I have after we hear from our guests.
Super. Thanks, Scott. That's really helpful, and I think because what you just described was really these three building blocks, I suppose, that you've used to kind of characterize that near-crisis scenario. And I know in the paper you kind of described them as being kind of building on top of each other, and you kind of need a combination of all three. So I'd be interested, I think, just for our audience at home, for us to talk through a few examples of real-world scenarios that you can kind of describe. Because I think what's very interesting in the paper is considering the near crises that didn't turn into full-blown crises, which is the whole so what of this, right? Of this analysis, which is if we can determine some of the variables that can affect whether a near crisis turns into a full-blown crisis, then we could potentially prevent crises from escalating, which is a really, really significant set of questions and thoughts to dig into. So I'd love to hear you and anyone else on the panel kind of talk about a couple of examples of these near crises and what we can kind of learn from those in these three buckets of those kind of whether we had, and counterfactual things are very difficult for us to talk about, but what are some of the elements that perhaps led to said example escalating or to another example de-escalating in terms of those three kind of key building blocks that you just walked us through? So happy to throw that to anyone.
Okay, I'll start with some of the key cases that we've looked at, and I'm curious to hear what the others have to say. Two good news stories, and I think just to provide some specificity to the variables that I think prevented near crises from escalating to crisis, focusing on technology. Technology is one element that I think we can think about as a tool to go into this conceptual escalatory process and ask ourselves how technology clearly, we think about technology as shaping threat. Defensive technologies reducing threat in and of itself implies that you're not starting to push the pressure along the escalatory path. Iron Dome is one of the interesting technologies that, through Stephen Lobel's research and interviews with Israeli officials, Iron Dome reducing the sense of threat and reducing time pressure on Israeli political and military leadership to take more aggressive actions that they may have been tempted to take, they may have taken in past episodes, rocket fire from Gaza Strip, for example. Israeli officials have actually noted that the Iron Dome directly impacted their perceptions of threat and time, and the likelihood then of, again, much more muscular action that would escalate the conflict across that border was reduced. There's another case that we have in our paper. It's a fascinating case from 1995 called the Black Brant case. And it was a Norwegian missile launch. It was a test missile that was designed to test the Earth's magnetic field and the northern lights. And it became a severe potential crisis for the Russians as they watched this launch. And it was fortunately the existence of satellite coverage over North American ICBM fields that told the Russians that the threat, even though they didn't identify the missile as a research rocket for about 20 minutes into its flight path, they understood that this was not directed at Russian territory. It didn't pose a direct threat. And Boris Yeltsin himself went in front of the press the very next day, described the incident, and described the fact that information awareness on the Russians' part through the technological means they had kept them on the left-hand side of the escalatory path, if you will.
And any other examples, real-world kind of examples or cases that stood out to any of the rest of our panel?
One of the ones that I've been thinking about, and what particularly is a challenge for identifying and coding which ones are near crises, is actually counterintuitively the Russian invasion of Ukraine right now. Because when you think about it, different actors can be at different places along the escalatory process. Clearly for the Ukrainians, we're in a full-blown war. The Russians refuse to call it a war, even though they've taken 100,000 casualties. And because NATO has taken the use of force off the table, does that, from a NATO perspective, then make it such that it is not even a near crisis, or are we in the near crisis space when anyone watching from the outside would say this is clearly a crisis for NATO, right? It's the concern, you have all of these troops that NATO has deployed along its eastern perimeter, but when, for political reasons, we have to say not a single member of NATO is going to die to defend Ukraine. And therefore, it puts it back in the near crisis space, even as challenging as it is right now. That, to me, is sort of the 800-pound gorilla of a crisis happening that for different actors can be at different places along the escalatory process.
So that's a really interesting question, I think, that you've raised, and you mentioned this in terms of perception. To what extent does that matter then, in terms of crisis escalation? Does there have to be a similar perception of where you are along the kind of spectrum of the crisis in order for something to occur? Or does it truly just require one actor involved seeing their kind of three core elements in terms of the time pressure, the threat to kind of core values, and the kind of military hostility? Does that only is there only a requirement for that to be there for one side for us to really start to see this kind of boiling into a full conflict? Or does there need to be some semblance of kind of alignment of perception of those three things?
No, just to go back to, this is a very important point. And it's something I think your question alludes to our natural assumption. And the natural assumption is a crisis or a near crisis involves the actors on rival sides of whatever the dispute may be have to perceive it similarly. And there are plenty of crises, the Cuban Missile Crisis, obviously the Berlin Crisis, these classic from the Cold War, in which the key actors on different sides of the dispute understood the situation they were in, were feeling the same dimensions of this problem in their own unique ways, but still feeling as though they were in a crisis situation. Where it becomes dangerous for us, and again, going back to this notion of diagnosis, even if you can't turn this into a good news story, even if you can't effectively manage the near crisis, and it does move along the escalatory pathway, there's anticipation and an early warning that you have just conceptually in terms of, if I'm not watching how, and it's not just my rivals, it could be my allies as well, who are perceiving themselves caught in a near crisis situation, frankly, those are the most potentially dangerous, because you don't give yourself the chance to actually weigh in with policy measures alone. One other quick example from work that Norman Ripsman has done on the Taiwan Straits crisis, the third Taiwan Straits crisis of 1995. And this crisis highlights the fact that the perception of threat and the perception of finite time is not just externally driven. It could come from domestic politics as well. So Jiang Zemin in 1995 is putting additional pressure on Taiwan, offering up some economic concessions, but trying to accelerate the timetable toward reunification. He's new in this position. He doesn't have his authority cemented within the Chinese political system. He's under tremendous pressure from PLA hardliners on the Taiwan issue. And this is the year in which the Taiwanese president came to the United States, was given a tourist visa to go to his reunion at Cornell University. And the Chinese reaction, it caused a kerfuffle. And the Chinese government had a relatively modest diplomatic protest to the travel to the United States, the visa that we granted to the Taiwanese president, we thought it had ended. We thought the crisis had diffused because it was, just some angry words, but it seemed to dissipate. Back home, Jiang Zemin, in the weeks to follow, was under tremendous pressure that I don't know whether American leaders were watching in terms of appreciating his sense of threat, not only in terms of Taiwanese independence, but threat to his own political power, and the finite time to deal with this consolidation problem at home, because the next Communist Party meeting was going to occur the following year, in which key votes were going to be taken on leadership positions. I don't think we were watching this, and it really flared into a full-blown crisis when the Chinese began their missile launches into the Taiwan Strait, into north of Taiwan, really driven by domestic level pressures that I don't think we were watching. It took us by surprise. So, this notion of one-sided crises is really important, and I don't think we appreciate that.
Sonia, did you want to
can I jump in? Because when so thanks, I enjoyed reading the report, and I really commend this idea that you guys were theorizing, trying to operationalize and even normalize the idea of a pre-crisis. And when I read through it, just to piggyback off of your point about domestic context, what I thought about is that to operationalize your framework, I think it really requires kind of a net assessment diagnostic approach. And I know the concept of net assessment is really about long-term competition, not to deal with crises. But when I was reading through this, and I thought, with the 3 factors that you've identified, and if you're thinking about threat perceptions, then diagnosing who are within relevant actors, who are the institutions and the stakeholders who are driving or influencing the threat perceptions. Then on the perception of time, the exact same things. What are the bureaucratic organizations? And just your example from the 1995 hit home the things that I was thinking about. I think if we focus only in on the actor that is doing the activities that is threatening, or, as your white paper said, shortening the time, I think that short shrifts the analysis that we can do on, well, what are the normal procedures, what are the normal actors that are going through. And one more thing, just on your first condition then, of the perception of threat, I did have a question I wanted to throw back to you. So in your paper, you constantly use the phrase, the threat to perceived values. And I know that's the academic language, but you even started with you wanted to bridge the gap. And so I admit, I was reading through here and I thought, why are you not using the language of the threat to the interests? And then thinking through, interests are constructs. They're generally consistent, but not exactly. And so again, diagnosing who are the actors in any given administration or time across countries, who's doing the inputs to how are we perceiving the interests and prioritizing? Because it's really the prioritization of the interests, because I think that's what you're getting to with your NATO example. We have interests, but we are prioritizing other interests that are not adding to this idea that this is a crisis for NATO, or a pre-crisis even in the definition. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. No, you're right. The definition that we have behind us and that you find in the white paper is from the academic literature. So those of you who have studied the academic literature on international crises know that this goes back to the mid-1970s. These terms are adopted across the academic community. Values are so personal, interests are so personal, they're so constructed, which I think doubles down on this basic point that strategic empathy, just at least this analytical assessment process, this diagnostic process you talk about, I wouldn't get hung up on the word. What is it? What is it that's being threatened? Is there something of high value? And perhaps that's the usefulness of the word value in and of itself. There's something of high value. It could be a material interest. It could be a political relationship. It could be the position of a leader within his or her own political system, the stability of that, their security at home. what is it that's of high value that's being threatened? Is there finite time to deal with that threat that I feel? And worst case, do I see the potential for military hostilities as a way to address this? But fair enough. I like the way, I don't know if it resonates the way I just described
it does.
What is it that you value that's serious enough that might push you along this escalatory path?
Yeah, I want to include more of our panel in this discussion, and I also really want to encourage our audience at home to please submit questions on Zoom. I am receiving them, and I will get to them. Not all of them, but I will try my best. So Lance, you look like you wanted to come in first, and then we'll go to Tom.
I'm definitely piggybacking on Sonia. In my impression, in the decision-making space, the influence of perceptions on each of those three factors in green is very different. Right? I can't do anything about your perception of your interests, but I might be able to manipulate your sense of the time horizon much better. Right? So I think that unequal distribution of where my leverage lies as a decision maker is pretty key to your analysis. And I definitely, my mind goes directly towards mapping potential pre-crises. That's exactly what I was thinking when reviewing the paper on my own. So to hear that echoed here makes me feel a little better.
Tom, would you like to?
Okay, Clementine, let me first say I'm delighted to be here from National Defense University's Research Institute, and so thanks to you and the team here at Atlantic Council, Scott, Stephen, and the research team. I really want to weigh in on this point right now, but I would be remiss if I didn't say I have both a confession and aspiration, right? A confession is I haven't had a chance to read the rich amount of work this team has done prior to the monograph that they have presented today, and there is a lot of that, and so let me put a plug in for that out there. My aspiration is that I get into some of that literature and have a little more time to look at some of the pedigree and some of the cases that we've been discussing here today. This paper, however, is one I want to comment on from my perspective as a research fellow at NDU, from my own past research, not as representing anything from the Department of Defense, National Defense University, or the US government, but rather to say that this is a very useful, I think, and important framework for understanding the stepping stones to getting us to the point where force and the use of force becomes inevitable. I think part of the background here of what you present that is useful is this notion that there are clusters of dynamics, short of military to military standoff and then use, where relevant things can weigh in, and you kind of articulate that there is this pre-crisis notion and we can do things short of actually trying to deter by better military force or better introduction of military things in the crisis phase to try to de-escalate. That's one of the critiques I have, is that I think there is a de-escalation framework that happens after military forces are introduced, right? You introduce military forces, back to the 95 Taiwan Straits example, you push US aircraft carriers into the Formosa Straits, China doesn't fire any more missiles, things stand back down. And so I think that is an area for potential future research by the team or others to think about those times when you get an additional line on your diagram, and the astute use of military force buys you, looking back at your circle about time, it buys you more time because the adversary says, well, perhaps I don't really want to go to the actual use of force because I'm not going to win this. And I've just been reminded of that fact by the introduction, by moving from, in this lexicon, pre-crisis to crisis. And I think when I read this through, and again, with deference to the fact I haven't looked at all the other literature, and there may be some things out there on that, I think that is a part of items that I would consider perhaps as a ground for more research. The second dimension, though, that I think we're touching on right now is kind of, how, from a policy framework, can we better use this kind of a notion to understand what we want to accomplish, which generally is not to come to blows, right? Generally is not to reach a crisis or a clash, although I think we got to acknowledge intellectually all clashes are not equal, right? So you haven't got infinite resources for everything. You had to ask yourself, are clashes in Azerbaijan and Armenia important for us to invest resources to understand, are we talking about true basic values or not? I like this paper and this framework right now because I think we are entering, and my own work is focusing on, an era of great power competition, where it really is the potential for armed clash between the great powers that is the enormous danger currently in the geopolitical system. Because history tells us is when the great powers come to direct blows, not proxy blows, not political, movements or feigned blows, that when you come to direct blows, that sets a cascading event of horrible outcomes, devastation and destruction that is altering for large swaths of the earth. So I think in this space, this is an important framework, and particularly the two green circles about what are the basic values at play from the great power, and then how much time do they perceive they have to move forward with them. The one example I'll talk about here, though, where measuring those things I think is difficult and where the devil's in the details, and Sonia alluded to this, is what is a true basic value? And in the paper, I'll just flag up one of the vignettes you used, the examples in the paper, which I found very, very wonderful to consider because I was incarcerated on the Joint Staff and working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2008, and I measured the number of weekends I lost to great crises in those days when I was in uniform, and one of those crises was, in fact, the Soviet aggression, the Russian invasion of Georgia. And so I'm pretty familiar with that from a policymaker's sense. And my only point in terms of measuring basic values is it's kind of hard to go back counterfactually without considering the presence of time and how basic values were being measured, right? Putin and the Russians were saying in 2008 that you can't do these map programs for Georgia and the Ukraine, but in terms of the time to deal with that or the actual threat to base values, first, it didn't seem like that was credible. It did not seem like Russia would go to war in Georgia in order to preserve a base value, because we didn't conceive that the value of near abroad hegemony and might makes right on the near abroad, that was still a standing premise for the Russians. Now, some did, but most, I would tell you, feeding information to decision makers in the military crisis area didn't feel it that way. Second, and this gets to kind of, other structures and things to buy more time, there was a belief that we had time built in because we had institutional structures appended to NATO, specifically the evolutionary construct of the NATO-Russia Council, where we thought this was a place where we could ventilate, they could have their day, they could have their say. We were letting them lean over our shoulder without a veto on NATO. And so I guess my point here is applying this really gets into how you think through and perhaps how you better assess what is a basic value? How do you know that on the part of the adversary? And second, what is it that you put in place, whether it be structures, political debate societies, other social animals, even perhaps military forces, that is not enough to buy you that extra time to resolve the crisis short of clash? I think a little more work in that area, and maybe you're doing this right now by mapping additional cases and thinking about them in time. Maybe that will help apply what I think is a very useful construct and thought process to the policymaking arena where I know you want to have an impact.
I'd love to hear from the other panelists on this point. I will just say from a research perspective, and Tom's comments get to this challenge, and it's a challenge for researchers looking for cases that then yield insights, and within the analyst community, how do you spot these things in the first place? And really from an academic perspective, anecdotally, talking to, for example, Stephen and I were at NATO headquarters and we went to SHAPE back in December and had conversations with crisis managers, with the head of the policy planning staff. And they both said outright that there's a lot of these near crises out there, but they're never captured. And from an academic perspective, all we have to go on is frankly, press reports. We do LexisNexis searches to try to accumulate a data set that then we can explore in more detail to play around with the different variables. And if the press doesn't pick it up because it was a near crisis and it in fact faded away before it escalated to some standoff, it's not going to get picked up. And the ones that are easy to study are the ones that get very dangerous. Whether they tip into war or not is less important than they got very dangerous in a public way. And it's easy for analysts in the practitioner community to go back and try to do a diagnostic on what happened, counterfactuals, what could we have done differently, and then from a researcher's perspective, it's just as challenging. So the Russia-Georgia case of 2008, and I'd like to come back to that at some point, but because it's such a rich case, but just to get this challenge out there, I think making the case for being aware of the pre-crisis space, having things to be sensitized to, seems to have value. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge what Tom just mentioned, that it's really hard because of the challenge of actually developing insight into what they value and how they calculate priorities, and how, when and under what conditions do foreign leaders feel time pressure. Logically, we know this makes sense. We see it in post-mortem studies of these cases, but ultimately the challenge, and again, I would be curious to hear, because there's so much experience in that realm on this panel, how you get at that problem.
So that dovetails with a question that I did want to ask, and I think, Brian, particularly with your background. So I think a lot of what we're talking about here is the importance of information, intelligence, diplomacy in this type of scenario in order for us to do two things, right? Understand what those critical values or interests are to the actors involved, but also to understand, to help maybe alleviate some of that time pressure, because the more we know, the more we understand how, well, we think we can understand how dynamics may or may not play out. Like, is this truly what's the time scale we're talking about? So I'd love to hear, I think, a little bit from, I know everyone has read some of the cases here. What are the lessons that we can gather from kind of the importance of intelligence, information sharing, those kinds of things? And then to what Tom was saying, the types of frameworks that enable us to gather that kind of really critical information in these key time periods.
Well, if I could, and again, I think this goes to the power and the utility of what's here still to be mined and explored, is, some refinement of what a base value is. And how we understand that. And again, Sonia alluded to this, and I'm just hoping to extend it usefully somewhat here. So we also have to acknowledge that leaders in duress will often faux signal, right? They will signal, this is a core value, stay away, red line, but then not follow through with it. And to the extent that you overbrand things that are declarative basic values to be that, you wind up with something that's less useful. Now, Scott, you already hedged against this by saying that we need to be more certain here in terms of how we understand this and be empathetic. Well, empathy is one thing, but having the intelligence, the good intelligence to know when you got a false signal versus an actual concern, I think in that space, you or your team or somebody else doing more review of historical cases to discriminate between when it was false signaling or not, and then what the pathways were from there, in order to cue in more on this basic value notion, because not all, quote, values, unquote, are things that states are willing to go and fight for, right? And that can be independent of the time they think to have to resolve the clash of basic values involved.
Can I go back to the question, though? When we say intelligence, we think of how are we going to analyze the other? And I go back to, I think, in your framework, it is a side-by-side. It's not just using intelligence to understand or have a strategic empathy about how the other sees the situation. It is just as important to look internally, the mapping internally of how we see the situation, we perceive the time. I mean, it takes two to tango for there to actually be a crisis. And that's where I think, to get to your point about the prevention, it's not even how we can affect others' behaviors, but what can we know about ourselves to influence those who are contributing to our perception of threat, our own perception of time. And so when we speak of intelligence, I just think from a policy perspective, we automatically go to how are we looking outside, not how are we actually looking inside to understand our own decision-making criteria. And so I think that's a really important part. And the normalization of this concept to then have people who have told you, oh yeah, we have all these near crises, we just haven't cataloged them or we don't really pay attention. I mean, now that the more that you normalize this and they can think through, well, what were our interests? How did we think and how did we perceive the time along the way? I think that will, over time, can give you the data set. You have to normalize them to think about that from our own side, not just the others.
So we've got a lot of practitioners on the stage here, and I think a lot of what we're talking about can sound very academic, right? And I'm sure all of you at some point in your career have been involved in that crisis decision-making moment. So I think what would be helpful for our audience at home to kind of think about the complexities of this, like if that being in the moment, how difficult is it to decipher information coming in like as live and in the moment? What are the challenges to really seizing some of the opportunities that Scott and the research team have analyzed and using those tools, those potential off-ramps to de-escalate a crisis? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Looking at you, Lance.
Crisis decision making is I guess my academic hobby, and I think that this framework is exceedingly useful. But it makes me think that of the crises that I've been involved in, it would lead me to believe that the more, and I would say pre-planning, but I don't mean in the sense like a military plan on the shelf, but I mean almost a pre-mapping of the decision-making space. What leverage do various government agencies have? How can we use non-governmental leverage? What manipulatables are there? What does the adversary or the challenge see? All of those things would help me, I think, in understanding what's in the realm of the possible. I don't know what you call that. It's certainly not a military plan. I think those kinds of products have been in government before. This is nothing new. But we struggle with what to call it because I think people are afraid of over-scripting or creating like a flowchart approach to decision making, and I certainly don't know any leader that would want that kind of approach taken. Not to be hemmed in, but the understanding the universe of manipulatables and perceptions, I think, would be very, very key.
So if I could, to just dovetail on that and talk back again about one of my own experiences while still in military uniform and in the Pentagon as somebody involved in these kind of decisions, you know, the 2008 event with the Russian invasion of Georgia. So there, I think, you know, pragmatically, there was an acute understanding, as is in the write-up, that Russia and Georgia were in a great point of tension, right? And that Russia, however, in terms of the three elements of pre-crisis and crisis, you know, that Russia did not necessarily have a basic value involved that would cause them to want to use military force. There was a lot of signaling going on. There was a desire to get NATO to change an approach that had aggravated Mr. Putin and his cohort. And there was a perception in terms of time and time management that time was on NATO's side. There was this thing called the Russia-NATO Council. There was a place and a forum to engage. Now, there were some ancillary factors, right? The Russians had notified NATO they were going to leave the Conventional Forces on Europe Treaty the summer before, and that clock was ticking. And there were a few other things showing Russian dissatisfaction with that diplomatic approach to, using this rubric, extend time to prevent the use of force. But there was also another factor, was there wasn't a perception at this point, and looking at the Russians, that they had a great capability to do much. Now, there was a failure of imagination here, because there wasn't a perception that they would go in and just basically squat on Ossetia and Abkhazia and say, move us if you can, you can't. But on the other side, I think we were trying to understand the Georgian motivations, and there was a lot of concern that Georgia had a core issue of trying to get under the NATO tent. They were perceiving their time as short to do that against the Russians, but that time management with them would be to tell them to calm down. We got a management process in place. They can't attack and do a lot that would, you know, take you, and kind of basically that since Georgians were partnered in fighting with us in Afghanistan, kind of a backdoor, unstated, but certainly reviewed in policy circles, whether we would be in a position or have to do something either with our air or with our ground to intervene if it looked like Georgia's sovereignty was going to be usurped. And so when I take this lexicon and this rubric and I look at those things, I say, from a policymaker's perspective, I think subliminally all of them are being addressed, but the question is whether they're being measured right? Whether you've got the other factors in. And in this case, part of the U.S. policy was telling Georgia to cool it, right? To not be moving forces and things around and to cool the rhetoric, in Tbilisi from generating these kinds of antibodies with the Russians. Obviously, it was wrong to prevent the ultimate outcome of an armed clash. But what I'm saying is how to think about applying that, given the vignette and the complexity, I think is kind of where the interesting additional research and work could go.
I think Brian wanted to.
Sure. One of the things that I really appreciate about this project is the effort to bridge the policy practitioner academic sort of divide. And I'll use an example from my Army career as an intelligence officer. I was stationed in Hawaii in 2014, 2015 at U.S. Army Pacific and had 200 analysts working for me making sense of the 36 countries in then PACOM, today Indo-PACOM. And it seemed like every time we were about to have a long weekend and get a couple days off, Kim Jong-un would launch another missile. And all of us would have to come into the office and deal with what from the analyst level was a near crisis every couple of months. But at the policymaker level in DC, it's just, yes, there's another missile being launched. It's Kim Jong-un expressing displeasure, right? All of that was factoring in. And the challenge that I see in a contemporary context is as we have greater open source intelligence and now on the other side, not being in government, but being at an open source intelligence research organization like the Institute for the Study of War, then in a more recent case, again, in the run-up to the Russian re-invasion of Ukraine, where the indicators we were looking at purely using open source intelligence were ambiguous about whether Putin was genuinely about to invade. And it's clear that the Biden administration had classified sources that were much more clear-cut that, yes, the invasion was about to happen. And they did a fantastic job in the information space of declassifying and sharing that with both the American public and with the Russians, saying, hey, we see this is about to happen. It's a terrible idea. Don't do it. And it was not able to de-escalate the situation because Putin perceived it to be a vital national interest for him. It was a closing window with potentially Ukraine being pulled into the Western orbit. And for him, it was worth going beyond crisis and into war. But how we fuse the classified sources with the open source intelligence is a challenge for the intelligence community inside government, but also for the non-governmental actors watching this space. How do we raise the red flag when we see it in the open source for policymakers inside government is an interesting challenge.
So we've got some great audience questions here, and I want to make sure that we're including our audience both in the studio and virtually. So we do have a question about the war in Ukraine at the moment, and I will maybe reframe it ever so slightly. But the question here is from Maury Miloff. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. But Maury asks, what failed in the lead up to the Russia-Ukraine war to prevent it? I think the question is, could it have been prevented? I'm not sure. But Maury asks, what could have been done? What happened in the pre-crisis which prevented it from being mitigated or moved it irrevocably in the direction of war? That's a big, tough question, I think, to answer.
From a purely conceptual perspective, and I am not an expert, there are folks who have been watching this much more closely than I have. But you alluded to it in the way you characterized the question. In this particular case, there may be some escalatory processes that are not possible to stop short of direct military confrontation. I'm just throwing that out there to see what might be applicable to this particular case or other cases that you may have been experienced. There may be situations in which we feel we need to take issued specific deterrent threats because our own sense of interest at stake and the severity of not taking action to deter forces us along the escalatory pathway, and that's a policy choice, right? So there's no automatic default to let's keep every situation that arises on the left-hand side of this flow chart. Sometimes we recognize the situation for what it is, the stakes are such that we're willing to fight for it, and we just try to dominate the process as it moves to the right. Maybe that may have been the case with Vladimir Putin's conception of his own interests at stake, the time pressures he felt to do something big, and it was worth it, and his assessment of the West's reaction felt he could pull it off at a reasonable cost, and there wasn't a heck of a lot you could do, even if you were sensitive, or at least maybe, as you know, to pick up on Brian's point, you have early warning, right? You're watching certain indicators that give you a chance to jump. Whether you're successful in preventing escalation or not is a separate question. You at least get an early move and start putting pieces in place and start thinking through your options that might either help you dominate the escalation or turn it off if things work out right.
Tom? Yeah.
If I could, I think that's an excellent question, and counterfactual is difficult, but some of the power of this model, I think, to thinking about what's going on in Ukraine that may help adjust the question a little bit is, think of it maybe in two layers and not one, right? What we have between the Ukraine and Russia now since February of 2022, almost a year ago, is an armed clash. What we have between the US, NATO, and Russia is a crisis, okay? And the escalatory ladder from the perception of the United States and its NATO allies, as difficult as that is for us to get our heads around, but I keep trying to because I look at great power competition and how great powers work through allies and partners and proxies. If you think about this as a proxy war that is short of the great power clash, we are in crisis by this definition between the US and NATO in that we're not directly armed clashing. Ukraine's not a member of NATO. Okay, it's not a formal ally of the United States.
So we're actually in pre-crisis.
So, but no, because if we're talking crisis, isn't crisis the fact that you have the imminence of military being used, and once military items start, you're in armed clash or armed confrontation? Did I misunderstand that?
I think that's accurate.
Right, because I think that
Brian earlier said we're in the pre-crisis for NATO,
right?
Because we are not engaged.
We are engaged though. We are militarily at the brink. We are at the hair trigger. We are in, with all due respect, I think we are in crisis with the Russians. We've been at a lower level of crisis perhaps since 2014 over Ukraine. But so if you think of it that way, then regrettably, but given the history of the way great powers interact with each other and how proxy wars tend to develop, you can look at a super layered set of things here. And the United States is perhaps, with its NATO allies, using Ukraine not only to stand forth in the basic value, which is sovereignty shall not be violated by armed force, but also using the next best thing to direct clash, which we don't want to do, which is somebody else using armed force, but we're standing by, showing the ability or the willingness to do it. And so that two-dimensional framework, I think, can also help in terms of figuring out what it is you don't want to happen. And in some cases, as I said earlier, armed clash at a lower level is better than armed clash at a more direct level if you're not willing to give up on your basic value or principle, i.e. the sovereignty of state borders recognized internationally that shall not be violated or abrogated by force.
So I think the answers here really, I think, illuminate how complex this is actually in terms of perception of even with Tom's helpful kind of two-level framework to look at the Russia-Ukraine war. Are we in pre-crisis? Are we in crisis from the US, NATO, Russia side? That's hard to determine. So a couple of other questions here. One from Tracy Wilson. In the nuclear weapons domain, Herman Kahn first articulated the concept of the 44-step escalation ladder, which I'm sure everyone's very familiar with, to help determine the state of the nuclear crisis situation. is there value in pursuing such a concept in your work on crisis prevention and management? So an escalation ladder of sorts for, I guess, near crises, and how could that be applied to crisis management? In the non-nuclear space, to be clear.
If I
think
understand
is the question.
Yeah, if I understand the question right, it's the value of pursuing Herman Kahn's much more granular breakdown of this process.
Very specific, and at that time always
Right.
two different actors, known actors, and it's so much more complex here, I think.
Yeah, I am no Herman Kahn. I'll be the first to admit that. Maybe this sounds like I'm begging off the question too rapidly, but this conversation is just so enlightening for me, and I'm sure my teammates are having the same reaction. The nuances, the complexities. This is obviously the most simple model when you put it in comparison with Herman Kahn's incredibly detailed, step-by-step, multi-actor model. But what he had the advantage in his situation, and all the literature on deterrence over the last 30 years makes this point that we had two key actors. We had the United States and we had the Soviet Union, and it simplified the analytical process. Even if the analysis could become highly complex, as Herman Kahn and many of his colleagues produced during that period of the Cold War, we're talking about a model that we're trying to generalize as widely as possible to as many parts of the world, many different types of actors, to include non-state actors, because we have significant work within the team on violent non-state actors. I don't see how you could capture that, but it just reinforces the complexity of this in a beyond the Cold War, a world dominated by two actors framework.
I think that what this makes me think about, though, a little bit, and maybe to Tracy's question, it's a different question, but in DoD parlance, we talk about the competition continuum, right? This kind of fluidity between, well, absolute war and absolute peace on either end, and everything that happens in between, and kind of the dotted line, so to speak, when something turns into, I guess, what you have described in the paper, which is like full-blown crisis that is then kind of a march towards war. But I think what we're talking about here a little bit is that the, I guess, potentially traditional views of seeing that as a kind of step-by-step escalation across the competition continuum it's not that simple. There is kind of fluidity and perhaps yo-yoing back and forth, and in some respects with new technology, Tom, you were talking about this in terms of no kidding conventional conflict of kind of breaching another country's borders as being the most aggressive and egregious forms of conflict.
Basic value too.
Yeah, a basic value. But then the other side of that with emerging technology, there are ways that you can cripple a country, cause a lot of mayhem that doesn't actually involve breaching their borders physically at all. So I think this is, as your work has really helpfully helped us think about different phases of a crisis or definitions of crises, I think this kind of helps us get towards understanding that competition continuum a little bit more broadly. And so I don't really have a question here, but more just kind of made me think about that. But I guess for the audiences at home, and because we are trying to communicate like the value of this concept to policymakers, a lot of those in DoD, but a lot of them not so, right? Because we've been talking about whole of government approaches here. My question is, deterrence is the core overarching goal of Biden's national defense strategy, right? The three kind of priorities outlined in the strategy are all meant to be gearing towards helping the US deter. So, and obviously they outlined this concept of integrated deterrence, which is integrating all aspects of national power across domains to achieve different effects. So what do you think are the implications, perhaps, of this framework for the way the US should be viewing deterrence or even integrated deterrence?
A quick thought from my perspective, but I'd really like to hear from our guests on this because it's something I've been wrestling with. You know, one of the key objectives of this project was to make it relevant to this critical concept within overall American defense strategy. My thought as I've been wrestling with this is that, you know, to use the most basic ways in which we think about different types of deterrence, whether it's general deterrence, is sort of a state of being that gets in the head of potential adversaries, that moderates their behavior, immediate deterrence in a particular pending crisis that requires very blunt signal of will and capability to punish or deny if the escalation continues. My initial thought was that general deterrence versus immediate deterrence. In an immediate deterrence situation, it sounds like to me, and I may be wrong, that you are by necessity pushing yourself along and trying to push your adversary along this escalatory ladder to full-blown crises, in that they find themselves in a situation which, if I take action A, I will be severely punished, and you hope that calculus kicks in to moderate their behavior. But you have to bring them to full crisis, to a full crisis headspace, if you will, in order to stop then the escalation to war. General deterrence, you may be able to manipulate through much subtler means their sense of danger if I work down certain roads, and there may be ways to develop a sense of costs short of the full crisis space. That's sort of my initial swag at this answer. I don't know if that lands.
Your question,
well.
actually, my notes that I took down last night, I was writing down with the fluidity, and that was actually the word that I used, in the types of tactics that are now going on, from mis and disinformation to cyber to proxies and across this span. And so I think I actually found your framework as so relevant today, given the space that there are so many different types of tactics that are going on below red lines, below where we think there will be crises. And so I thought, I actually had a question about your paper, and I won't take it away from there, but you had said, in trying to get to the prevention, what you wanted to do is map out different zones where great power interests might collide. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way. That's a geographical approach to trying to anticipate where crises could be. But I think today it's so much more complex than just geography, given the technology, the other things, and the fact, and maybe what was driving me in the whole circle of what I was thinking last night is that so many of these different tactics now aren't necessarily going straight towards military hostilities. They're actually going towards more human security concerns, which even broadens the number of actors who are weighing in on what our interests or the values that are at stake at the time. So I love the simplicity and the fact that we can make this even more complex. Your framework, that it broadens our understanding or anticipation of what are the different types of threats and actors involved. And it also opens up, a course that we're about to start teaching at the National War College, a course on all instruments of power, and really thinking through how can you maximize the utility of those different instruments? What are the value? No instrument of power, I think, has a usefulness inherent to itself. It's in given situations. So, thanks.
One of the things I was thinking about is, how do we account for adversaries' efforts to re-baseline our perceptions of what is and is not a pre-crisis? Yeah. And the case that, for me, is most illustrative here is the way in which the People's Republic of China has created a baseline when it comes to probing Taiwanese airspace. You think about the use of the information domain, you think about the threat of kinetic activity in the run-up and after Speaker of the House Pelosi's visit as the sort of the most recent case of this. And they've created such a situation where we've become inured to that, and we don't recognize it in some ways for the pre-crisis that we ought to. And how do we then sensitize ourselves with the right indicators and warnings to recognize when we ought to be in a pre-crisis in that sort of situation?
Can I ask a question here, though, just definitionally? Do we consider Taiwan and China to be, by the lexicon here, a pre-crisis or a crisis? Given the number of military forces involved, is that, am I correct in understanding that would be considered a crisis in this framework? Because the military instrument is so present and so pregnant?
You know, we've debated this within the team, and the sense I think that we've come to, I mean, recognizing the challenge of potential pre-crisis and potential crisis is embedded within the enduring rivalry and the increasing capabilities on both sides of the Taiwan Straits. It seems that this sense of time pressure becomes, so the only way I can understand and categorize this particular relationship, to me it makes more sense to describe it as an enduring rivalry with many danger spots, opportunities for actions, for signaling that might impose a sense of time pressure on either side of the straits or within the United States that compels action. And again, I always come back to what is it that changes a sense of this is really sort of just the day-to-day reality of the Western Pacific, but there could be key moments, key decisions, key actions that all of a sudden feels different.
It's an urgency.
An urgency, and urgency compels action. And action could come in the form of escalation. So I think we have sort of tended to look at this as just sort of a steady state and watch for those moments, those decisions, those signals that may increase time pressure, increase urgency. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but I think it's the best way we within the team have been able to grapple with that great question.
Well, and this comes back to an earlier point about it depends on from whose perspective are we looking at this?
Yeah.
Right. From the Taiwanese perspective, we are in crisis on a regular basis.
Have been for a long time.
Yeah, okay.
And from an allies and partners perspective, it's, like I said, the Chinese have rebaselined us and gotten us so accustomed to this that we don't recognize it in the way the Taiwanese do.
And simultaneously, they've expanded military capabilities now, particularly in their long-range missiles, artillery, anti-space access, so that they now have a much more viable military option in terms of this that is credible to the United States, right? That means we can't do a redux of the 1995 float the aircraft carrier in and the Chinese will calm down. But you know, arguably we are there now. I mean, by this model, both sides have a legitimate capability to use force. There is baseline values involved, and you know, we are kind of there, trying to find ways to expend the time and allow time maybe to settle and calm this thing down. But maybe I'm misunderstanding that dimension of time as being a precursor that you must have in pre-crisis, and then you add the imminence of military threat to make it a crisis.
This is incredibly useful feedback. And it reinforces what I had said at the outset, just in terms of appreciating that different actors, even actors on the same side of a dispute, may perceive where they are in this model in very different ways, which sets up a challenge to the relationships we have. It sets up a challenge for assurance, right? Assurance is an American strategic goal in terms of making sure allies and partners that we have made commitments to trust that we will support their interests. If there's this fundamental asymmetry in terms of our understanding of what situation they are confronting, we may either lose assurance, that confidence, and that may be the source of weakening assurance. And if we don't appreciate it early enough, they might start taking independent actions that then does draw us in once we finally wake up to their perspective. And then, you know, going back to this, I love the idea of rebaselining and desensitizing. In the white paper, and this goes back to the Georgia-Russia case as well, it's a phrase that we use there. In the aftermath of the initial pre-crisis, the dispute in April of 2008 is about a Russian MiG-29 shooting down a Georgian reconnaissance drone, and it creates this, what we called a pre-crisis situation. After a UN investigation and after a lot of publicity, the Georgians were satisfied, the Americans, the NATO, the EU were satisfied that we have successfully diffused this crisis. But on the Russian side, and one of my West Point colleagues, who is one of the co-authors of this paper with the team, brought in that, because he's an intelligence officer, and he talked about how adversaries can desensitize. They can renormalize through certain military movements and positions of certain forces and capabilities that you become accustomed to over time, and it may be a precursor for something more dangerous, which is what occurred then by the summer of 2008 with the war between Georgia and Russia. So this, again, the bottom line takeaway for us is, again, appreciating the different actors seeing themselves at different points within this, and at least being aware of that from an American perspective is of value.
So we only have a short amount of time, like a couple of minutes. So there are kind of two things I just want to hit on. And I think Brian brought up something crucial. If we don't ask about the context of strategic competition between the US and China, then I would be missing out on a key aspect that people wanted to hear about. So given what Brian just described in terms of rebaselining, for China trying to rebaseline with the United States, change our perceptions of potentially what could be a crisis in the making. What are some of the key lessons learned, I suppose, from the research that you've done that we should be looking for to help us determine what are flashpoints that we should take very, very seriously?
Well, again, this is just from my perspective, not from the practitioner community, and all I have to fall back on is an appreciation for the basic concepts that we have. I mean, and obviously this notion of sort of war gaming out different scenarios, I would imagine is part of the process in terms of thinking about capabilities within the region across different domains of activity, what might either increase perceived threat or increase perceived time pressure to react. I would imagine it's already part of the practice within the policy community to sort of have this analysis of the different players and what kinds of scenarios might all of a sudden begin to accumulate.
That makes sense. Any thoughts from our practitioners?
The thing that I've been thinking about, and I'm working a project right now between the Institute for the Study of War and IBM's Center for the Business of Government on visualizing the information domain. Because, of course, we have ways to visualize the 5 conventional domains: air, sea, land, space, cyber. And we can portray those for military commanders and policymakers to understand, are we winning or losing in those spaces, right? What is the state of play for the distribution of forces, these kinds of things. We struggle with how do you perceive through visualization where we are in the information domain. And the escalation process and whether we're in a near crisis or not really depends on understanding the cognitive and how each side views the crisis, how they are using information operations to influence one another, that we don't really understand how that, who's winning and losing in the information space. And that's something that I think to bridge the academic and practitioner divide is something that we need to work on, is this idea of visualizing information.
So one final question for each of you, because what we've tried to do here, I think, is exactly as you just said, Brian, bridge this gap, right, between academia and policy. And the intention here is for policymakers to be able to take and digest some of this. So what is your top takeaway for policymakers from this framework? What is the one thing that you would want to leave them with as they face every day forms of crises, near crises? and unfortunately probably will continue to face some boiling over of crises. So what is that one takeaway from each of you that you'd want to leave us with?
To me, the key value proposition for this project is to sensitize the policy community to the fact that the pre-crisis space needs to be thought of more systematically and needs to be war gamed out in terms of how do you manage problems and how do you detect problems before they begin to escalate, as opposed to sort of the default to significant action occurs when you actually reach the full crisis stage.
Sonia?
I'd say for anybody with a specific policy portfolio, I would take this framework and map who are the actors that are involved in influencing each of those conditions or those layers, especially the first two, as a good starting point for normalizing your thinking about who's involved in the perceptions, who's involved in the perception of time and threat, and do it from your portfolio perspective and the range of what's under your.
How do you bring together the policymakers and academics to better think through how to be proactive in this space rather than reactive, right? How do you shape a situation to de-escalate, to deter? What are the tools we need to use, and how do we understand the indicators?
Yeah, from my perspective, this is very useful as a bridge, and congratulations to the Minerva framework and you guys for jumping on that, because you have thought academically about things that matter and resonate in policy. And as somebody who was on the policy side of the bridge for quite a while before moving over now and hopefully producing some of this same kind of analysis, I think the real important and useful takeaway here, particularly now that we are entering a new era, okay, beyond global war on terrorism, beyond American unipolarity, beyond a bipolar construct, is since this structure helps one understand the interaction between all of our tools of power, because let's face it, pre-crisis, the way you guys have defined it, is generally not going to involve military tools. And so that means the intelligence, information, analytical framework needs to be different parts of our government, right? National Security Council can control and interact, but State Department, intelligence agencies, so maybe a little more focus there in thinking about the pre-crisis and understanding these variables before we're at a point where the military is going to be involved or has to be involved in those cases where we are not directly engaged. And here I think the Arctic example is useful in your paper, although albeit long range, right? I would say right now military planners are not going to be heavily engaged in the Arctic because we don't see a lot of issue there. But the pre-crisis mentality about this becoming important over time, I think would lead a policymaker correctly to say, let's invest time, money, and effort in understanding these variables as they apply to great power competition in the Arctic in time so that we're not having to leverage military tools. Thanks.
I am struck by what you said about the inculcation, the socialization of this model into policy practitioners. And I think the value is in making it systemic, just like you said. I think I can imagine, too, a major divide between the sort of hypothetical pre-planning office or pre-crisis planning space and crisis management decision-making. But I suppose that's a topic for another day.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to thank you all, our panelists, for really such a rich discussion. I think we could keep on going for a long, long time. There are so many rich issues to address from here. I guess what this says is read the report, because there's a lot in there. And I hope that this is just the start of conversations like this. So thank you to Scott, Sonia, Brian, Tom, and Lance. And thank you to our audience at home for tuning in. And we will see you at our next event.